Hello guys, we Weeb online, and today I'm gonna tell you about what if Naruto knew his parents since childhood, the movie. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
Kakashi rubbed his temples in an attempt to alleviate his pain. Naruto's continual ranting was terrible enough, but with a hangover on top of it. He grumbled, why couldn't Naruto have his mother's appearance and his father's mentality instead? He could feel 3 pairs of eyes burning into him as there was a sudden quiet. Oh my, I didn't say that out loud, did I? He pondered. Did you know who my parents were? Naruto inquired, surprised. There was no way he was going to be able to mend this. Any decision he took from here would land him in terrible trouble with the Hokage. Even more serious than the danger he was already in from mentioning Naruto's parents in the company of another human being. One alternative, on the other hand, might get him into the least amount of difficulty and prevent him from being followed around by Naruto, who is continuously pressing him for information about his parents. Your parents were both friends of mine, he said, which was somewhat true. They passed away on the same day you were born. Your father died fighting the Kyuubi, and your mother died as a result of complications during childbirth. How come you didn't tell me this before? Naruto inquired, his eyes filled with the same betrayed look that Sensei's had the day he finally snapped and placed Obito in a bag and beat the snot out of him. The Hokage wanted to protect you because your father made some dangerous enemies who would gladly kill you if they couldn't get their revenge on him. And he reasoned that if you didn't know anything about your parents, you wouldn't be able to accidentally say something that would link you to your father. He explained. Oh, Naruto expressed his disappointment while also expressing his understanding. Because of the nine-tailed fox situation, there had been more than enough persons pursuing his blood, though they usually limited themselves to doing things that wouldn't get them jailed or killed. Kakashi dismissed his students for the day after explaining why he hadn't spoken anything about Naruto's parents earlier. He needed to clear the rest of his afternoon for the massive chewing out he was about to receive. He was going to inform the Hokage of his blunder before the old man heard about it from another source. And he needed to clear the rest of his afternoon for the massive chewing out he would be receiving. Following his dismissal, Sasuke stared in disbelief as the pink-haired irritation walked away without groping him or attempting to set up a date with him. Where are you going? He said, attempting not to appear interested in the response in case she realized her error and returned. The pink-haired pest said, I'm going to check if I can find out who Naruto's parents were. He was intrigued after hearing Kakashi's explanation. While much had been spoken about the prankster who had swapped his lunch with a fairly unhappy frog during their first week at the academy, little had been said about his parents, and he now wanted to know who the hell could have created Naruto. On the one hand, this would provide some encouragement to the pink-haired pest, but on the other hand, Pinky was a genius when it came to research, and with someone assisting her, the answer would be revealed much sooner. I'll help, he responded, knowing that not knowing the answers to his queries regarding his blonde teammate's origins would irritate him more than the pink-haired pest would. They walked to the library after leaving the training area, where Pinky started browsing through the citizen rolls while he went to the binders with brief bios on shinobi who had died in the line of duty. He went through the volumes from 12 years ago, looking for the blonde ninja who had perished on October 10th. After roughly 10 minutes, Pinky muttered, odd. He was perplexed. What? He inquired. His maiden name is the same as his mother's. Pinky was the one who responded. She was one of the Uzashigakure exiles admitted into Konoha's ninja troops. According to this, have you had any success thus far? I have 12 blonde males who perished fighting the Kyuubi in my possession. 7 have brown eyes, 3 have green eyes, and 2 have blue eyes, he responded. The first 10 can be ruled out. Uzumaki Kushina had gray eyes, according to her profile. Pinky remarked this as she brought up a bio with a shinobi registration photo of a lady who looked like a red-haired version of Naruto on it. So, who's left? Says the narrator. Sakura inquired. Yamanaka Akira, 16 years old, and the 4th Hokage. Uchiha Sasuke replied, bringing their profiles closer to her so she could see them. He doesn't resemble him at all. After carefully analyzing the Yamanaka's face and finding almost nothing in common with Naruto, she murmured, pushing the young man's profile away. His hair was the wrong shade of blonde, and his eyes were the incorrect blue. There was just one other profile left after the Yamanaka was eliminated. They both glanced at the image before turning to face each other. It's appropriate. He was Kakashi teacher. Sensei's he was blonde with blue eyes and perished fighting the Kyuubi on the day Naruto was born. She shook her head, almost unwilling to believe what she was seeing, especially given her mother's comments about the lad in question. "There's no way in hell," Sasuke declared. The elemental affinity test papers had come very easily to Sasuke. He'd only had to inquire about them from the owner of a business that sold them, and the guy had gladly delivered him several free samples, shaking slightly and motioning for his children to hide as he did so, as some villagers had been known to do after that man had. Regardless of how they were delivered, he was grateful that the man had given them to him free of charge, because he'd checked the price and the dang things were pricey. Only one of them cost around the same as a C-ranked mission, which is why most ninja waited until they were Chunin and therefore close to financial security before purchasing one to test their affinity. Because chakra affinities tended to flow in families, he'd requested the affinity testing sheets. He had searched up the fourth Hokage's name and discovered that it was Wind. It would prove that Naruto was not the son of the fourth Hokage if he had any other affinity than Wind. He decided to put Naruto to the test the next day while they waited for their normally late sensei to arrive after he'd left the shop and its relieved keeper behind. The waiting had been the most difficult part. He'd been up all night watching the papers in case they vanished while he wasn't looking, and he'd practically dashed to the bridge in an undignified manner as soon as the sun broke through the horizon. Things would return to normal as soon as he could prove to himself that the idiot wasn't the Yondame's kid. Sakura caught herself staring at Naruto after arriving for training that day. She wanted to believe Sasuke when he swore there was no way Naruto could be the fourth Hokage's kid. But the more she stared at him, the more parallels she saw with the Yondame photographs she'd found in the historical archives. Something about Naruto's jawline, as well as his hair when it wasn't kept back by his Hide-8 or goggles, made her wonder why no one had ever seen it before. While she joyously envisioned Ino's stunned expression when she learned that her competitor had lucked out and been placed on a squad that included not only Sasuke-kun but also the son of the fourth Hokage, she knew she couldn't tell a soul. She remembered Kakashi saying that Naruto's father had a lot of enemies who wouldn't hesitate to murder him because of his kinship, and she didn't want that on her mind. Naruto irritated her, yet she didn't want him to die. She didn't even notice when her dear Sasuke-kun arrived as she stood there studying her blonde partner, who became more of an enigma with each passing second. She didn't realize Sasuke was there until he approached Naruto and began speaking with him. Naruto stared down at the piece of paper, puzzled, but after a few false starts, he did what the arrogant bastard demanded. The paper immediately tore in half. Was it supposed to rip like that? He wondered, his gaze falling on a piece of paper that had been cut in half diagonally. After witnessing the result, the Uchiha was surprised for a fraction of a second, but soon recovered, removing a book from his pocket and quickly leafing through it until he found the right page. He looked a little disturbed as he read it because of the information it contained. "Try it one more." As he removed another small piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to him, Sasuke replied. This sheet of paper, too, was torn in half. He stared at the two halves of the sheet of paper in his palm and stated, "I guess it was supposed to do that." Again, just as Kakashi came, Sasuke said as he handed Naruto a sheet of paper. He stood on the railing of the team's normal meeting site, the bridge, and observed as Naruto took the paper and concentrated for a moment. The paper was torn in half. Naruto was his sensei's son, despite inheriting Kushina's beauty and energetic demeanor. "Hello, everyone. Please accept my apologies for being late. I'd gotten sidetracked down memory lane," he added, signaling his presence to his classmates. Sasuke finished the last of the books he had checked out after 2 days of research into affinity types. The fact that they shared the same affinity type wasn't proof that Naruto was the Yondame's son. It simply indicated that there was a higher chance that they were linked. It was plausible that Naruto's father was the Yondame's fourth cousin twice removed or something, and that they shared the same elemental affinity thanks to a common ancestor who lived long before Konoha was founded. He needed a second opinion, which meant he'd have to ask one of the smartest people he knew, despite the fact that he was lazy as hell and would most likely reject out of spite or because it would interfere with his nap time. He could already hear the sigh of frustration and the muttering of troublesome. He went to the Nara residence after returning the books. The Naras were slackers to a fault, but they were talented. His father had once asked Nara Shikaku to build the profile that had assisted the KPMF in apprehending a serial killer, so he knew for a fact. Nara Shikamaru was closely studying Naruto an hour later. As soon as he concluded his inspection and returned to him to give him the results, the sluggish kid murmured, "Troublesome. The answer to your query is probably certainly yes." Shikamaru spoke softly. Uzumaki Naruto's right eye has 2 little spots that are inherited. In the close-up they utilized in our textbook, you'll observe 2 identical places in the fourth Hokage's right eye. Hey, what exactly are you two talking about? From the opposite side of the field, Naruto yelled. He answered, angry, nothing really, Shikamaru just doesn't want to go have ramen with us. He'd owe the Nara a significant favor for doing something that didn't offer him a firm answer. But he'd also have to buy Naruto as many bowls of ramen as he could eat in one sitting, as that was the price of enticing him out here on his day off. Shikamaru had been examining his sensei's last move in the current round of their never-ending game of shogi when the man had finally posed the question that had plainly been plaguing him 2 hours after his examination of Uzumaki Naruto at the Uchiha's demand. He knew Asuma-sensei had been loitering near the field's edge, close enough to intervene if necessary but far enough away to give him, the Uzumaki, and the Uchiha some privacy, and that he had been unable to hear any of the conversations that had taken place while he had come to the unsettling realization that the most hated person in Konoha was the son of the 4th Hokage. He also knew that his sensei was intrigued about what had been going on, as the scenario was uncommon in that the teams hadn't actually communicated since graduating from the academy, but that he was willing to wait until he could inform him. What were you discussing with the Uchiha at Training Field 7 earlier? Finally, Asuma-sensei inquired. Suddenly, an unpleasant thought entered my thoughts. He was well aware that the Uzumaki's lineage was a closely guarded secret that should not and could not be exposed even to those in the know. Otherwise, everyone would have known and commented on it. And he had always despised the Uchiha. The kid was a haughty brat who never seemed to appreciate what he had. As soon as Ino realized what he was about to say, Uchiha Sasuke recently learned Uzumaki Naruto's wind affinity and wanted to trade him for Ino. Haruno Sakura apparently hadn't stoked his ego enough, for he also wanted the second most rabid member of his fan club on his team as he made his move. He replied. Really? Asuma inquired, her eyes wide with curiosity. Ino had apparently gotten on his nerves once more. That girl would be a terrifying kunoichi if she had the power to back up her arrogance. But since she didn't, and every other conversation was about clothes, Sasuke, or her diet. However, Dad, you have a wind affinity. Asuma moaned in a way he hadn't since begging his father to purchase him the super great sword he'd wanted since he was 12 years old. He didn't have the sword, either. I'm sorry, son, but I can't change the genin teams once they've been passed until a member is either promoted or leaves the shinobi forces either feet first or otherwise. The Sandaime Hokage replied with a sigh. He wasn't sure what had triggered this, but if he could have given in to his son's pleadings and gave him Naruto, he would have. And not just because it was a pain in the neck. This was the first time in a long time that his son had turned to him for help. But it was a shame he couldn't give it to him. Mamachi Zabuza, who was standing on his sword stuck in the trunk of a big tree, was having a conversation with Kakashi, who was reaching for his Hit-I-8, when Sasuke's voice cut through it. It was almost unimaginable that a mere genin had dared to intrude while the adults were getting the pre-battle banter, which normally gauged how serious either side was about the oncoming combat, out of the way. But Sasuke didn't seem to mind. What are you looking for, brat? Zabuza inquired, his gaze falling on him. He inquired, have you seen images of the 4th Hokage? Yeah, but why? Says the narrator. Zabuza responded, perplexed as to why the youngster would interrupt with something so entirely unrelated to the current scenario. I was just looking for a second opinion. Is it true that my teammate Uzumaki Naruto resembles the 4th Hokage or not? He inquired, emphasizing the Uzumaki because, in his eyes, it was all Naruto was. Zabuza shifted his gaze to Naruto. He'd get his answer soon, and it'd be no, and everything would return to normal. There was no way in hell that the idiot, the dead last, the one who was detested by almost everyone except Yumino Iruka, the one who only graduated because of the 3rd Hokage's apparent favoritism, who seemed to regard him as a pet, was the son of someone as powerful as the 4th Hokage. Kakashi stared at his new least favorite student, speechless by the magnitude of the boy's latest act of insanity. He intended to assassinate Sasuke. He planned to kill him in the slowest and most agonizing way possible. He hadn't told Naruto who his father was because he couldn't expose something the youngster didn't know under questioning. And Naruto had understood and accepted this. Sasuke was now attempting to reveal Naruto's parentage to the entire goddamn world. Uzumaki, isn't Takeshi Uzumaki's grandson? Zabuza inquired, his eyes darting around Naruto, as if looking for something. And not sure. Kushina was his mother's name. His surname is the same as her mother's. Sakura was the one who responded. Zabuza's eyes widened a little as he heard this. Plans have changed, Zabuza explained. With the exception of Naruto, I'm going to kill you all. Why? Sakura inquired in a screechy tone that appeared to pierce your skull and stimulate the portions of your brain that gave you headaches. Because, unlike Naruto, my family has no big debts to any of your families. Zabuza spoke as though he were teaching something basic to a child. Debt? Sakura inquired. How much do you owe him? Says the narrator. It's all non-monetary. Zabuza shouted this before lunging towards him to begin the long-awaited combat. He jumped back, ignoring any thoughts about how a family could owe such a debt to a family of foreign shinobi, particularly shinobi from a town that Kiri had helped to destroy. But he'd have to think about that one later. Sakura moaned as she dropped down on the futon supplied for her at bridge builder Tezuna's residence after the unconscious Kakashi-sensei was ensconced on one of his own. Tsunami, Tezuna's daughter, was in the next room, tending to Sasuke ribs. Her own back hurt, and she was pretty sure it was just one big bruise. She had her moments where she despised Naruto, and this was one of them. The demon of the mist had pursued them in such a way that it appeared he was playing with them before killing them. Despite Kakashi's best efforts to protect them, Sasuke had been drop-kicked twice and thrown into a tree. And what did Naruto end up with? Before being gently moved away from the battle, he was patted on the head. Not that he was completely unaware of what was going on, but nonetheless, Sasuke felt he should have learned his lesson after the Zabuza incident. But he still wasn't persuaded that the dead last Uzumaki Naruto was the fourth Hokage's son, though he was willing to agree that there was a slim chance if there was enough unanimity on the subject. However, if the fourth Hokage had a child, he should be incredibly great as that man was before he went insane and slaughtered the clan. On second thought, this is a poor example. He'd had bruises on bruises on bruises for the first week after returning from Weeb, all thanks to one Hatake Kakashi. This should have taught him something, but like most Uchiha, for example, one Uchiha Madara, he could be tenaciously persistent in continuing to his course even when he was clearly in the wrong and could be gravely hurt or killed if he continued along it. It was now the Chunin exam, and he had a wider pool of neutral and, theoretically, completely objective subjects to poll on Naruto's paternity. He felt that now was as good a time as any to pose his inquiry, given that all of the attention in the room was focused on himself and the rest of the rookie genin from their year immediately after entering the room where the first portion of the exams was to take place. Everyone, pay attention. I'd like to ask you a question. Is there a resemblance between my teammate Uzumaki Naruto and the fourth Hokage? Is it a yes or no question? He screamed, pointing to the blonde with the whiskers. Before absolute chaos broke out, there was a brief pause as the entire audience considered the subject of his inquiry. When Ibiki and the proctors arrived to deliver the first Chunin exams test, they were greeted by applicants from Iwa and Kiri jumping out the windows, accompanied by cheers. What the hell is going on? Run for your lives. And the yellow flash reproduced. It's in Uzumaki, of course. Correspondingly, Kumo's candidates gathered around Konoha's resident Jinchuriki, bowing and addressing him as Uzumaki-sama. He had no desire to know. When it came to the Uzumaki, it was better to stay in the dark. Orochimaru sighed as he sat at the front of the room. Kabuto was staring at him, clearly looking for answers that he didn't have because he'd given up looking long before the Uzumaki boy's mother died. There were some things that guys, even men who were obsessed with knowing everything about everything, weren't supposed to know. The Uzumaki had always been strange in that way, which made their alliance and rumored relationship with the relatively strict Senju all the more strange. He did the only thing he could think of in this situation. He gave the boy a fuck if I know shrug and tried to forget about the events of the previous few minutes before a big headache struck him, similar to the one he'd had after the time Kushina had. He'd believed he'd repressed that, but he hadn't. Of course, at the best of times, repressing Kushina's entire existence, as he had been doing for the previous 12 years, was a futile exercise. If only she hadn't fallen so enamored with him after she'd determined she both loved and despised him. Team 7 had met up with their sensei immediately after the written portion of the examinations had ended, despite the fact that they should have been cramming for the next phase of the exams. To summarize, just 12 teams made it through following the departure of the whole Kiri and Iwa delegations, who had only attended due to a great deal of political squabbling on the Hokage's part. This was only thanks to Naruto's fairly timely or untimely but wholly unexpected encouragement. Naruto and Sakura joyfully approached Kakashi, still overjoyed after their victory. But Sasuke stood back, instinctively knowing what was about to happen. Kakashi-sensei, Kakashi-sensei. We passed the first round of testing, Naruto excitedly exclaimed as he danced around his teacher. People from Kiri and Iwa leaped out of the windows to escape Naruto, and the Kumo boys were acting strangely during the exam. Sakura stated after their teacher thanked them, relaying what she considered to be the most interesting piece of information to emerge from the exam. How strange is that, says the narrator, Kakashi inquired, his customary lazy demeanor giving way to a more alert demeanor. They were bowing and calling Naruto Uzumaki-sama. One even volunteered to sharpen his pencil for him, and I swear I saw another steal it after the test was finished. Sakura was the one who responded. Ah, I see. Kakashi began to relax as soon as he recognized that his student was not in immediate danger, and that the second phase of the exams would be easier for him because the most concerning group had opted to flee rather than fight. Wait, what was that all about? Naruto inquired, perplexed. Kumo allegedly kidnapped Uzumaki Kushina, who was later recovered by Namikaze Minato, who followed a trail of her hair she had left behind. Unofficially, Kushina became tired of waiting to be rescued, and Jashin's followers elevated her to sainthood following the incident, despite the fact that she did not follow their religion. According to legend, she made the Yondaime Reikage eat his own spleen just before Minato-sensei arrived to save him. When asked, why the spleen, she is said to have said that she had failed anatomy and grabbed the first item she could find in the hopes of finding the liver. Kakashi was the one who responded. After hearing his sensei's story, Sasuke curled up even more tightly in his hiding place. How could the son of all of that wind up being so darn average, let alone the dead last? Oh wait, he'd decided that Naruto wasn't the fourth Hokage's offspring. He was going to choose to trust the official story that Kakashi had presented for the sake of his sanity. The Yondaime had unmistakably rescued the vulnerable Uzumaki Kushina, with whom he had never had intercourse. Kushina had possibly asexually reproduced or something when Naruto was conceived. Sasuke felt a shiver run up his spine for a split second before he found himself in the shade. And don't think for a second that I haven't thought of you. As he gazed down at his wayward and probably suicidally foolish student, Kakashi muttered bitterly. In comparison, what transpired next made Sasuke's return from Weeb appear like a walk in the park. There was a fair chance he wouldn't have been alive and well by the time Kakashi was done with him if he wasn't needed to help his teammates grow. Hokage Sandaime, after finishing the report he'd gotten, saw Ruto by Haruzen's side. Uchiha Sasuke and Haruno Sakura had figured out an S-class secret about their comrade months earlier, but it wasn't the one concerning the Kyuubi. He hadn't expected his teammate and long-standing crush, Uchiha Sasuke, to reveal the truth because she was a notorious gossip, but she hadn't stopped her teammate and longtime crush from doing so either. The previous time Sasuke revealed Naruto's parentage to a foreign shinobi, they were extraordinarily fortunate because the shinobi perished before they could share or, more likely, sell the information to others. They were not so fortunate this time. In a couple of hours, the secret had made its way across the continent, trailed by a number of fleeing Iwa Genin squads. Genin tells his teammates that he'd only just made it into the exams, which were held in Konoha for the first time since the war, and only after making countless compromises to that arrogant bastard Onoki. The fact that the truth about Naruto's parentage had come to light now was both concerning and unfortunate, as Naruto was not yet capable of defending himself against any assassins who might slip past his ANBU guard, especially now that the boy's abilities had dropped sharply in certain areas, particularly stealth and evasion. He knew why, and he was terrified that the decision he'd just taken would bite him in the arse. Naruto's remarkable capacity to compartmentalize things was the reason the child wasn't a raging maniac. According to the Yamanaka who examined the boy, and further buried the element of the child designated Dark Naruto. Unfortunately, this compartmentalization propensity has a number of downsides. He sighed again and summoned Naruto. Sakura worriedly watched and waited for her missing teammate. The Chunin exam's second phase was about to begin, and if he didn't arrive in under a minute, their team would be disqualified. With hardly seconds to spare, Naruto appeared, turning the worry into panic. When he emerged, the first thing she saw was that he was carrying a large rucksack and sporting a wicked grin she hadn't seen since the academy. While it wasn't strictly against the regulations, practically everyone else had arrived with only themselves and their equipment pouches, since they didn't want to be weighed down by something like Naruto's massive pack in a life or death situation. Naruto, on the other hand, seemed unconcerned. "Why are you bringing that backpack, Naruto? It will only slow you down," she inquired because Sasuke, who had a black eye and a split lip as a result of Kakashi's 2 slip-ups while playing Leave No Marks Where Anybody Can See Them, appeared adamant about ignoring Naruto's existence totally. The old man assured me that pranks were not childish and that I didn't need to grow up and stop pranking people now that I'm a genin. Unfortunately, he also informed me that I could only prank ninja who had attacked me or my allies, which is a bummer because I had a mile-long payback list that I had hoped to complete. Fortunately, he said I could use the ones he said I should never use again on anyone who attacked me, my friends, allies, or the village itself, Naruto said, his nasty grin widening even further. Sakura was temporarily taken aback by the proctor's shudder as she handed the students their release of responsibility paperwork, as well as the apprehensive glance she gave Naruto as she held his out in a shaking hand. Sure, Naruto smacked the instructors in the face with an eraser now and then, switched the clocks around, and did a million other little things. But it couldn't be that horrible, could it? Despite the fact that it was the last thing he should be doing, Orochimaru drew back coughing and rubbing his burning eyes. He'd been chasing the Uchiha boy up a tree 1 second, and the next, he'd been hit in the face by a pepper bomb set off by the Uzumaki brat, who he could still hear laughing that incredibly evil laugh that brought back memories of the child's mother, such as the time she ... and the time she ... and the morning she... Oh my goodness, he'd thought he'd been effective in suppressing those. Naruto prepared a variety of cunning traps around the grass ninja, who was currently gripping her head and chanting. Sasuke stood there watching repress. Uzumaki Kushina was a fictional character that never existed. Repress. This isn't something that simply happened. Repress. From what kind of family did that young man come? Oh, remember, Naruto's mother was a helpless kidnap victim who, like her son, finished last in the academy. Regardless of how many people seemed to believe it for whatever reason, his father was not the Yondaime. Naruto wasn't unique, and those weren't traps. They were just a collection of pranks similar to the ones Naruto used to do at the academy. That was his version of events, and he was sticking to it, as he helped construct a house as part of a D rank that was supposed to restore Konoha back on its feet. Sasuke flinched as he heard another statement of just like his father from one of the villagers who hadn't stopped chattering since the invasion. When he tried to establish that Naruto wasn't the Yondaime's son, he reportedly opened a can of worms, and people started perceiving a likeness that wasn't there. It didn't help matters that the Chunin exams culminated in an invasion that Naruto assisted in repelling, beating the bizarre monster that the boy who had been his opponent in the final round of the exams had transformed into in the process. It didn't help that Naruto had called the Toad boss Gamabunta, who had last been seen near Konoha while the Yondaime were fighting the Kyuubi during that fight. Almost everyone was convinced right then and there that Naruto was the Yondaime's son, and there was a lot of rumors about the Yondaime and Naruto's mother, whom the ninja had all dubbed Habanero, floating about the village. When he didn't get looks of fear, or wary looks as if the person looking at him thought he was about to snap at any second and go on a killing spree, or when mothers weren't pulling their children away from him more frequently than usual, he tried pointing out that anyone could summon Gamabunta if they signed the Toad summoning contract. If the villagers who didn't think he was a raging madman who needed to be put up for everyone's safety are to be believed, he wasn't attempting to be reasonable about it, and was just incredibly jealous that he wasn't the most important member of his squad. For some weird reason, they seemed to think he enjoyed being the last of the Uchiha. Naruto had become increasingly nervous following the invasion and its aftermath, especially when the villagers began smiling and greeting him nicely, and had locked himself up in his apartment, which he had ringed with a vast number of traps. He didn't totally blame the other lad, given how odd it was for the villagers to act that way toward the dead last, who had been nearly universally despised for as long as he could remember. If he had been in a comparable scenario, he would have probably done the same thing. The Uzumaki had wished for the villagers to be polite to him his entire life, but that didn't mean the poor stupid bastard would know what to do when they finally were. Someone came running, shouting something about Itachi turning up to kidnap Naruto, as he was painting the exterior of the house he'd helped restore under the cautious eye of the contractor, who'd been muttering about genin labor not being what it used to be. Great, even the betrayer and murderer of their clan had joined the Naruto as the son of the Yondaime bandwagon. Wait, what? Sasuke raced to his sensei's apartment as soon as the contractor let him go after realizing he wouldn't be getting any more work out of him because he was so distracted and 2 seconds away from fleeing anyway, where it was confirmed that Itachi had indeed attacked, and that his target had indeed been Naruto. He'd then run out of town with the purpose of chasing Itachi down after receiving said assurance from a loose-lipped Ayaba who'd undoubtedly wanted him to run off and die considering. He had finally arrived at the inn where Naruto and the Toad Sage, whose contract had started the whole Naruto as the son of the Yondaime saga in the village, were staying while Naruto was fighting Itachi, and a blue stranger in a cloak that was identical to Itachi's were staying while Naruto was fighting Itachi, and a blue stranger in a cloak that was identical to Itachi's. Both guys were attempting to apprehend Naruto, while Naruto was attempting and failing to flee. As he watched Naruto struggle, a jealousy arose within him over the fact that Itachi hadn't even considered killing him when he'd arrived in Konoha, mirroring the wrath he felt over the fact that Itachi had come to Konoha and tried to take away his team the way he had taken away his family. He was aware that it was a little sick, but you're simply attempting to kidnap Naruto because you think he's the Yondaime's son. He screamed angrily at his older brother, who hadn't even looked at him when he came. Well, now that the cat's out of the bag, sure, Naruto is the Yondaime's son, but that's not why we're bringing him along. Little brother, Itachi said as he reached for the Uzumaki again. No, he isn't, he screamed, irritated that when he finally saw his brother after learning a fantastic new assassination jutsu that could truly kill him if he remained still long enough for him to use it. It became all about Naruto, as it had been lately. Yes, he is, says the narrator, Itachi responded, while his colleague, who had been standing off to the side, looking open-mouthed at the entire interaction, eventually rushed in to stop Naruto from fleeing. He charged Itachi with an aggressive chidori that gouged a line in the wall, yelling, "No, he's not. He is," says the narrator. Before the jutsu could connect, Itachi caught him and broke his arm. When he was finally able to see clearly and breathe without screaming, he cried, "No, he's not." And they were perplexed as to why I was the favored. Itachi grumbled and shook his head. Tsukayomi, 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 Tsukayomi. Sasuke found himself witnessing the Yondaime walking about with a hugely pregnant red-haired woman who looked a lot like Naruto. Rather than seeing his clan die as Itachi had planned when he was 8, he was walking about with his arm around her waist and his hand on her stomach, telling a much younger version of himself and Naruto's sensei that he would teach their child when he grew up. As the scene turned to see a very pregnant red-haired woman being led through the woods by an old woman and the Yondaime, a voice stated, "Yes, he is." The red-haired woman, who looked eerily like Naruto, screamed at the Yondaime, informing him that if he wanted another one, he'd have to give it birth himself. His own mother grabbed his shoulder, spun him around, and told him to go home and watch Sasuke. He defiantly answered, "That's not proof." He hadn't witnessed the red-haired woman give birth to Naruto, so there was no way of knowing if these scenes were real or if they were staged. He overheard a groan, and if I didn't know any better, I'd swear I broke him. Somewhere in the distance as the scene changed to reveal a red-haired woman storming into their house uninvited, yelling something about being pregnant, and someone named Minato being the father at the top of her lungs, causing his father to choke on his dinner while his mother, who appeared to be pregnant herself, got up and ushered the strange woman out. "That's still not proof," he said to his brother, who was someplace nearby. Orochimaru might remark that after less than a month in his company, he was relieved that he wouldn't need anything other than Sasuke's body for the transference when the time came. There was something wrong with the youngster that was more serious than his own brokenness. Even he could not deny reality to the extent that Sasuke did. The idea that Sasuke had chosen to focus on that, and it was what had led him to join him despite the fact that he lacked a curse seal, rather than a desire for the power to defeat his older brother, was deeply upsetting. Regardless of how hard the Uchiha boy tried to deny it, the Yondaime was Uzumaki Naruto's father, and he was glad of it because, with little Minato keeping her occupied, Kushina hadn't had as much time to hang around him and shred what little sanity he had left with her bizarre and logic-defying antics. When Kushina wasn't thinking, she could do things that broke the rules of the world, and her kid looked to be following in her footsteps. It wasn't simply the boy's unusual ability to turn even the most toughest criminals into saints after a battle. Little Sasuke was in his bed, grumbling about how his former friend wasn't a Yondaime son, and how the Uzumaki boy's mother was a regular woman who couldn't terrify the sage of the 6 paths himself shitless before stealing the rest of his sanity if he had the misfortune to meet her. Great. He'd have to spend the rest of the afternoon repressing Kushina's presence once more once he got the little brat out of his room, whom he was beginning to think wasn't worth it. He didn't deny Kushina existed, he simply decided to forget about her for the sake of preserving his sanity. After all, there was a reason he'd tried so hard to suppress Uzumaki Kushina's existence. And it wasn't only because of their strange one-sided love-hate connection. Yes, it was fortunate that the only part of Sasuke's brain he would require was the one that controlled his eyes. Since his arrival, the youngster had been bringing up memories that should have been buried. Like the time Kushina had it in her head that, and the time she tried to, and the other time Kushina had. And then there was the time he went for a walk and came across little Minato and Kushina. And there was that time when Kushina was significantly pregnant. Great. It's fantastic. If there wasn't a risk of damaging a section of the brain that made the Sharingan work in addition to the typical ones that controlled the eyes, he'd do the lobotomy right now. If they didn't fall into both categories, there had to be a reason why the Uchiha were either insufferably arrogant or batshit insane. Tobi stared at the younger Uchiha's last sentence as he listened to Sasuke mutter as he pulled on his brand new Akatsuki cloak, certain that he'd misheard the lad. He'd heard his cousin had peculiar views about the Kyuubi Jinchuriki, but he must have misunderstood him, right? I mean, his relative couldn't possibly be that dense, right? Could you repeat that? He requested, anticipating what he was about to hear. And everyone is talking about Naruto like he's the Yondame's second coming. I'm not sure why everyone thinks he's his son. Sasuke dutifully repeated the command. It's most likely because he is. Tobi couldn't trust his cousin's denial, so he said something. He and Madara had denied reality as it was, but that didn't negate the fact that it existed. They just refused that this was their reality and worked to transform it into something more positive. Sasuke, on the other hand, despite the fact that he was still wandering around in this reality, Sasuke appeared to be living in another. Not you, either. Sasuke screamed his displeasure. Not me, too, he inquired. I was present at Naruto's birth and even held him when he was just 2 minutes old. If he isn't the Yondame's kid, his father must be a clone or something, because he gets everything from Maihi that he doesn't receive from his mother. Of course, none of this addressed the question of why he'd been there, what he'd been doing at the time he was holding Naruto, or how he'd known the Yondame well enough to recognize him beneath all that Kushina when it came to Naruto. Apart from Rin, who would be returning to him soon, Minato prior sensei's life was a closed book to him, including the fact that Minato sensei had only ever had eyes for one lady, and that woman had only ever had eyes for Minato sensei. He'd seen the two of them at the wrong time enough times to know it was true. He'd been enjoying himself as he walked across the park, sucking on the sweets that elderly Lady Hanako had given him as a treat for rescuing her dog from a tree. He had no idea how the small Shih Tzu had gotten up there. He heard giggling as he walked past the empty playground. He turned around to see that the playground wasn't quite as deserted as he had assumed. On the swings, Minato sensei and Kushina-san were having a good time. On the same wavelength, they're facing each other. Kushina's skirt, on the other hand, was, yes, it was long past time to get out of there before he was permanently scarred. Again, damn, and he'd thought he'd succeeded in suppressing it. He'd done it 50 times before. Why, oh why, had he had to be a student of a borderline exhibitionist who was dating and then married to a woman who, for all intents and purposes, didn't know what the word inhibition meant? As far as he was concerned, the only surprise about Naruto's birth was that he hadn't been conceived years earlier. I'm still not seeing it. Sasuke interrupted Hashirama's explanation of why he was shocked that Konoha was still standing with Tsunade as Hokage, as well as Minato's hushed explanation of why he had Yondame Hokage sewn on the back of his coat that an incredulous Tobirama was receiving. What do you mean you don't see? As Tobirama signed, Sandame inquired, is it true that they were that naive? To the Yondame in early ANBU, there's no way Uzumaki could. Hiruzen interrupted Sasuke with an incredulous look. Are you still talking about that? What are you talking about? Minato inquired, his ears perking up at the mention of his wife's surname. Naruto's teammates, being the astute children that they are, deduced that Naruto was your son. Since then, Sasuke has been in denial, Sandame elucidated, and Hashirama was perplexed as to why I wouldn't allow him to appoint Madara as Hokage. Tobirama grumbled, breaking the stunned hush that had descended on the group. How could they not have realized Naruto was my son beforehand? Minato inquired, his tone indicating that he didn't want to hear the answer because he knew it would disturb him. Since you weren't there to protect him, I felt it was in Naruto's best interests to keep his heritage hidden from those who weren't already aware. Hiruzen responded, a tinge of remorse on his face. Despite everything, how could they not recognize him as my son? He was a complete clone of himself the last time I saw him. Even the strongest Iwanin soiled themselves when Minato spoke with that deadly glare in his eyes. Let's just say your color is the only thing he seems to have acquired from you. Kushina provided everything else, Sandaime responded. Minato exclaimed, "Oh dear, Kushina isn't responsible for everything." Orochimaru chimed in as well. "He has a good chance of following in your footsteps and becoming the next Hokage." "Crap," muttered the Yondaime. "There goes Konoha," says the narrator. As he and Madara reassembled themselves, there appeared to be a pause in the battle. Obito deduced that people were waiting for the next monologue to rest up while he and Madara tipped their hands by disclosing more of their plans and a few S-rank secrets based on the way they were standing there almost eagerly following a partially unsuccessful attack on their persons. When it came to what appeared to be an S-rank secret based on the astonished reactions of a few civilians out in the boonies who'd overheard Sasuke's incessant ranting on the subject of a specific opponent. "Hey, did you know that Namikaze Minato is Naruto's father?" he inquired, a stab in the dark. "Yes," nearly all of the gathering shinobi exclaimed. Standing in the back row, a man who appeared to be cannon fodder and was definitely from a little village in the middle of nowhere raised his hand. As he granted the man permission to talk, he felt a little like an academy instructor. "Yes?" he asked. "I didn't," the man admitted, his face flushed with embarrassment. "What was that all about?" says the narrator. After he'd completed reconstructing, Madara inquired. "Well, after I told Sasuke that I'd personally caught my former sensei and his wife doing the horizontal mattress tango for the 27th time, and a civilian who overheard us discussing the matter seemed surprised that Naruto was sensei's son. I was beginning to wonder whether, what does it say for our clan if it was just Sasuke who was that stupid?" He responded. "Can you tell me which one it was?" Madara inquired, her face perplexed. "Huh?" he inquired. "Was it the 27th time you'd caught them? Or the 27th time you'd had to tell this Sasuke?" Madara inquired, his face set as though he was anticipating a negative response. "I'd have to say both," he said, given he was telling him about the 27th time he'd caught them. "And I'd cautioned them about the dangers of marrying your first cousin," Madara moaned, his face buried in his fists. "And then she licked my face after she kissed her way down." Namikaze Minato continued his narrative of Naruto's conception the night he was born. "It must be an Uzumaki thing," says the narrator. Hashirama spoke from where he was listening, oblivious to the fact that almost everyone else had their ears covered. "And then she kissed her way back up after she finished licking it. And then Minato moved on, oblivious to the Shodai Hokage's remark. "Please, please, 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 please," Sasuke, who couldn't hide his ears since he was shackled, screamed, not wanting to hear any more of his old teammate's pregnancy. "If you simply quit talking about Naruto being your kid, I'll admit that there's a chance he's your son. So you're not interested in learning more about Kushina's?" With a nasty glimmer in his eye, Minato inquired. "No," screamed Sasuke. "So, do you want to learn about her hobbies while she was pregnant with Naruto?" When Minato was plotting a joke, he questioned with a devilish grin that curiously called Naruto to mind. "Oh, she went a little wild while she was pregnant, didn't she?" Hashirama murmured, a smirk on his face. "The stories I could tell you about Mito getting sick while she was pregnant with our child." "Keep your mouth shut. Keep your mouth shut." Sasuke let out a shriek. "Why don't you both just shut up? I'm not interested in hearing about your love lives or the children you've had. So, okay, you've won. Naruto is your son, so be quiet. If I ever hear from you, or if I ever see you." The Shodai and Yondaime Hokages were screamed at by Sasuke. Does that mean he doesn't want to hear about how Madara and I used to be friends and how Tobirama was to blame for everything that occurred to his clan? Hashirama inquired. "Wait, what?" says the narrator. Naruto and Sasuke stood before the Sage of the Six Paths, having just accepted his legacy after learning that they were both reincarnations of his sons Asura and Indra, with Sasuke being the reincarnation of Indra who sought power, and Naruto being the reincarnation of Asura who sought peace, love, and cooperation. With this in mind, the frequent fighting between them, as well as Naruto's insistence that they were friends despite Sasuke's numerous attempts to murder him, made a weird sort of logic. "See, I was correct," Sasuke smugly stated as Naruto and Sasuke returned to the living world to fight Madara and prevent the infinite Tsukuyomi from being awakened and bringing the end of the world. "Right about what?" Naruto inquired, puzzled. "The fourth Hokage isn't your father," says the narrator. Before returning his attention to the Sage of the Six Paths, Sasuke remarked. "He is," says the speaker. Naruto only groaned and hid his face in his hands. In whatever incarnation, his brother was obstinate as hell, and would rather kill himself than acknowledge he was wrong.
So this was the end of this movie. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any suggestion, please share it in the comments. Till then, Weeb offline.